A black woman saved the life of a millionaire who was on the road. Years later, he discovers the shocking truth about his past. Night fell over the deserted road, enveloping the landscape in a blanket of darkness. Angela Martinez, a 35-year-old nurse, drove her old Chevrolet carefully, the headlights illuminating the asphalt in front of her. She was exhausted after a long shift at the hospital, but her watchful eyes never left the road. The radio played a soft melody, almost drowned out by the roar of the engine. Angela sighed, running a hand through her curly hair. Her dark skin glowed under the light of the dashboard, highlighting the small expression lines around her eyes, silent witnesses of years dedicated to caring for others. She thought of her mother, alone at home, waiting for her as she always did. A tired smile played on her lips as she imagined the warm embrace that awaited her. Suddenly, something caught her eye. A faint glow at the side of the road, almost imperceptible. Angela slowed down, frowning as she struggled to see better. Her heart raced as she made out the shape of an overturned car, partially hidden by vegetation. Without hesitation, Angela pulled over to the side of the road, the emergency lights flashing in the darkness. She grabbed her first aid bag, a habit she never abandoned, and ran towards the accident, the gravel crunching under her feet. "Hello? Is anyone there?" she called out, cautiously approaching the wrecked vehicle. A faint groan answered her call. Angela skirted around the car, her medical training taking over. She found a man trapped in the driver's seat, blood dripping from a deep cut on his forehead. "Sir, can you hear me?" Angela asked, her voice firm and reassuring. "I'm a nurse. I'm here to help." The man mumbled something incomprehensible, his eyes struggling to stay open. Angela quickly assessed the situation. The car was unstable, and she knew she had to get the man out of there as quickly as possible. Carefully, she opened the driver's door, which creaked in protest. The smell of gasoline filled the air, increasing her urgency. Angela worked methodically, checking the man's vital signs and looking for any other serious injuries. "What's your name?" she asked, trying to keep the man conscious as she worked. Richard, he managed to say, his voice almost a whisper. "Okay, Richard, I'm going to get you out of there. It's going to hurt a bit, but I need you to stay with me. Okay?" Richard nodded weakly. Angela, mustering all her strength, began to pull him out of the vehicle. Each movement was calculated, balancing the need for speed with care not to aggravate possible internal injuries. Finally, she managed to get him out of the car. Richard was heavier than he looked, and Angela felt his back protest as she dragged him to a safe distance from the vehicle. She laid him carefully on the ground, quickly checking his vital signs again. "You're doing very well, Richard," she encouraged him, wiping the blood from his face with sterile gauze. "I'll look after you until the ambulance arrives." Angela picked up her cell phone and called emergency, her voice calm and professional as she gave precise details of the patient's location and condition. As she spoke, she continued to monitor Richard, applying pressure to the bleeding wounds and checking his breathing. Time seemed to drag on as Angela struggled to keep Richard stable. She spoke to him constantly, her soft voice a beacon in the darkness of the night. Richard alternated between moments of lucidity and confusion, his blue eyes focusing and blurring on Angela's face. "Angel," he murmured in a moment of clarity. "You're an angel." Angela smiled gently. "No, Richard. I'm just a nurse doing my job." As she cared for him, Angela couldn't help but notice the details that spoke of a life very different from her own. The expensive suit, now blood-stained and torn, the gold watch on his wrist, the subtle perfume that still lingered despite the smell of smoke and gasoline. This man belonged to a world she only knew from afar. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the sound of sirens cut through the silence of the night. Angela felt immense relief run through her body. She squeezed Richard's hand gently. "Do you hear that, Richard? Help has arrived. You're going to be fine." The paramedics arrived quickly, taking over Richard's care. Angela passed on all the information she had gathered, her professionalism evident in every word. She watched as they prepared Richard for transportation, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction. One of the paramedics turned to her. "You saved his life, you know that? A few more minutes and—" Angela just nodded, a lump forming in her throat. She watched as they loaded Richard into the ambulance, her hands shaking slightly now that the adrenaline was starting to subside. "Do you want to go with him?" the paramedic asked. For a moment, Angela hesitated. Part of her wanted to accompany Richard, to make sure he was okay, but she knew that her work there was done. Others would take care of him now. "No, thank you," she replied softly. "He's in good hands now." Angela watched the ambulance drive away, the red lights disappearing around the bend in the road. She stood there for a moment, letting the reality of what had just happened settle in. Then, slowly, she walked back to her car. Sitting behind the wheel, Angela finally allowed the tears to come. Tears of relief, of tiredness, of emotion. She cried silently for a few minutes, her hands clutching the steering wheel. When the tears had dried, Angela took a deep breath, pulling herself together. She looked at her watch and realized how much time had passed. Her mother would be worried. With one last look at the scene of the accident, now surrounded by police cars, Angela started the car. As she drove home, she couldn't help thinking about Richard. Who was he? Would he have family waiting for him? Would he survive? Angela shook her head, pushing these thoughts away. She had done what she could. The rest was up to fate. Now, all she wanted was to get home, hug her mother, and rest. What Angela didn't know, as her car disappeared into the night, was that that unexpected encounter on the deserted road would change her life forever. Fate had intertwined her path with Richard's in a way she could never have imagined. The journey that had begun that night was far from over. And so, with her heart filled with a mixture of emotions she could barely comprehend, Angela moved on, leaving behind the place where her life had taken an unexpected turn. The future, with all its surprises and revelations, was waiting patiently on the horizon. The constant beeping of the machines was the first sound Richard Hartley registered when he woke up. His eyes opened slowly, blinking against the fluorescent light of the hospital room. The pain was a constant presence, a pulsating reminder of the accident that had almost cost him his life. As his vision adjusted, Richard tried to move, only to be stopped by a sharp pain in his torso. A groan escaped his dry lips, attracting the attention of a nurse who was checking his vital signs. "Welcome back, Mr. Hartley," she said with a gentle smile. "Try not to move around too much. You've had surgery and need to rest." Richard frowned, his memories of the accident hazy, fragmented. How long? How unconscious was I? His voice came out hoarse, almost unrecognizable to his own ears. 3 days, the nurse replied, adjusting the IV. "You were very lucky, Mr. Hartley, if it hadn't been for the woman who found you on the road." The nurse's words triggered a memory, a gentle face framed by curly hair, dark eyes full of concern, a soft voice keeping him conscious. "The woman, the nurse who helped me. Where is she?" The nurse looked surprised. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hartley, but she didn't come with you in the ambulance. We don't know who she was." Richard felt a wave of frustration. How could he thank the person who had saved his life if he didn't even know her name? Before he could ask any more questions, the bedroom door opened and his personal assistant, Melissa, rushed in. "Oh, thank God you're awake!" Melissa exclaimed, her face a mixture of relief and concern. She approached the bed, holding a folder of documents. "Richard, you have no idea how much chaos your absence has caused. The board is panicking. The shareholders are demanding answers." Richard held up a hand, interrupting Melissa's flow of words. "Not now, Mel. I need you to do something for me first." Melissa stopped, surprised by the interruption. "Sure, anything. The woman who found me on the road. I need you to find her." The determination in Richard's voice took Melissa by surprise. She looked at the nurse, who just shrugged, equally confused. "Richard, you've only just woken up. Maybe we should concentrate on your recovery first and—" "No," Richard interrupted her again, his voice gaining strength. "She saved my life, Mel. I need to thank her. Use whatever resources you can, but find her." Melissa nodded, recognizing the resolve in her boss's eyes. "I'll do my best," she promised, making a note on her tablet. In the days that followed, Richard divided his time between painful physiotherapy sessions and impromptu meetings in his hospital room. Nervous executives and worried lawyers paraded around the room, all anxious to ensure that the Hartley empire didn't crumble in their leader's absence. But to everyone's frustration, Richard's mind seemed to be elsewhere. Between signing documents and making crucial business decisions, he was constantly asking about progress in the search for the mysterious woman who had saved him. A week after waking up, Richard was sitting on the edge of his bed, his body still sore but determined to regain his strength. He was looking out of the window, watching the city below, when Melissa entered the room. "Any news?" he asked, without turning around. Melissa sighed, placing a folder on the table next to the bed. "Nothing concrete yet. We have some images from the security cameras on the road, but the quality isn't good. All we know is that she was driving an old Chevrolet." Richard nodded slowly, his frustration evident. "Keep looking. She can't have just disappeared." Meanwhile, miles away, Angela continued her routine at the hospital, completely oblivious to the frantic search for her identity. She had told her mother about the incident on the road, but kept it to herself. One particularly hectic afternoon, Angela was doing her rounds when a colleague approached her. "Hey, Angie, you won't believe what happened. Remember that millionaire guy who had an accident a few weeks ago? He's offering a reward to find the person who saved him." Angela froze, her heart racing. "What? What do you mean?" Her colleague continued, excited by the gossip. "It's in all the papers. Apparently he's obsessed with finding this person. They're calling it the search for the angel of the road." Angela felt the blood drain from her face. She mumbled an apology and walked away quickly, finding refuge in an empty corridor. Leaning against the cold wall, she closed her eyes, trying to calm her breathing. Why was he doing this? Angela didn't want recognition or reward. She had only done what any decent person would do. The idea of her private life being exposed, suddenly becoming the center of attention, terrified her. That evening, when Angela got home, she found her mother, Esther, watching the news. On the screen, Richard Hartley's face filled the screen, his determined voice echoing through the room. "I owe my life to this person," Richard was saying to the camera. "All I want is the chance to say thank you in person. If you're watching, please get in touch. Your privacy will be respected. I promise." Esther looked at her daughter, recognition shining in her eyes. "Angela, darling, it's about you, isn't it?" Angela collapsed on the sofa next to her mother, the tears she had held back for weeks finally escaping. "I didn't mean it, Mom. I just wanted to help." Esther hugged her daughter, her voice soft and comforting. "I know, my love. I know. But maybe you should consider talking to him. Put an end to this search." Angela shook her head vehemently. "I can't, Mom. Our life. It's good like this. Simple, but good. That man, he belongs to another world. A world that isn't for us." Esther sighed, stroking her daughter's hair. "Sometimes, Angela, fate has plans that we don't understand. But it's your decision, and I'll be by your side, no matter what you choose." Meanwhile, back at the hospital, Richard was standing for the first time since the accident. Leaning on a cane, he looked out of the window of his room, determination shining in his eyes. "Mr. Hartley," his doctor said, entering the room, "I'm impressed with your recovery, but I still think it's too soon for you to be discharged." Richard turned around, a determined smile on his face. "Doctor, I appreciate your concern, but there's something I need to do, and I can't wait any longer. I'll continue my treatment at home." The doctor knew it was useless to argue. With a resigned sigh, he nodded. "Very well, but promise you'll follow all the recommendations to the letter." "I promise," Richard replied, his gaze returning to the window. Outside, the city stretched out, vast and full of possibilities. Somewhere, in that sea of lights and shadows, was the woman who had changed his life, and Richard was determined to find her, no matter what the cost. As night fell over the city, two souls, separated by circumstances and choices, were about to be reunited by fate. Angela, determined to keep her anonymity, and Richard, equally determined to find her. The stage was set for a meeting that would change both their lives forever. And so, with the end of his stay in hospital, Richard took the first step on a journey that would lead him not only to his mysterious savior, but to a truth that would shake the foundations of everything he believed he knew about himself and his past. The months that followed the accident brought subtle but significant changes to the lives of Angela Martinez and Richard Hartley. While the search for the angel of the road gradually faded from the headlines, both tried to resume their routines, carrying with them the invisible marks of that fateful night. Angela arrived at the hospital that fall morning, the fresh air bringing with it the scent of fallen leaves and freshly brewed coffee. She adjusted the badge on her uniform, a gentle smile forming on her lips as she greeted her colleagues at reception. "Good morning, Angie," called out Marta, the middle-aged receptionist with whom Angela had developed a friendship over the years. "Ready for another day?" Angela nodded, her smile never faltering. "Always, Marta. Every day is a new opportunity to make a difference." As she walked through the familiar corridors towards the pediatric ward, Angela couldn't help but reflect on how her life had changed in recent months. The attention that the search for Richard Hartley had attracted had eventually waned, allowing her to return to the relative obscurity that she so cherished. However, something had changed inside her. The encounter on the deserted road, although brief, had left a deep mark on her soul. Angela often found herself thinking about the man she had saved, wondering how he was, if he had fully recovered. There were times when she almost gave in to the urge to reveal his identity, but the fear of the consequences always stopped her. Entering the pediatric ward, Angela was greeted by smiles and enthusiastic nods from her little patients. There, among the children who were bravely battling illnesses bigger than themselves, Angela found her purpose. "Nurse Angela!" shouted Lily, a 7-year-old girl with leukemia. "Have you come to hear my new song?" Angela approached Lily's bed, her heart warming at the girl's radiant smile. "Of course, darling. I can't wait to hear it." As Lily hummed a nursery tune, Angela gently checked her vital signs, her mind momentarily free of worries. It was in these moments that she knew she had made the right choice by remaining anonymous. Her life, simple as it was full of purpose and love. Across town, in an office at the top of a towering skyscraper, Richard Hartley watched the cityscape through his panoramic window. His body had healed, but something inside him remained restless. "Mr. Hartley," the voice of Melissa, his assistant, brought him back to reality. "The board meeting starts in 5 minutes." Richard nodded, adjusting his tie. "Thanks, Mel. I'll be there in a moment." When Melissa left, Richard allowed himself another moment of reflection. The months since the accident had been a whirlwind of physical recovery, therapy, and an even deeper immersion in business. Outwardly, he was the picture of success, the powerful CEO who had overcome adversity and come back stronger than ever. But internally, Richard struggled with a sense of emptiness that he couldn't explain. The search for the woman who had saved him had become an obsession in the early months, consuming resources and time. Eventually, pressured by the council and advised by his lawyers, he was forced to publicly give up the search. However, in secret, Richard never really stopped looking. He had hired private investigators, offered anonymous rewards, all in the hope of finding his mysterious savior. Each false lead, each dead end, only increased his frustration and determination. Sighing, Richard picked up his briefcase and left the office. In the elevator, surrounded by anxious executives and nervous interns, he wondered, not for the first time, why that meeting had affected him so deeply. The board meeting went ahead as usual. Figures were discussed, strategies debated, decisions made. Richard conducted everything with his usual efficiency and charisma, but his mind occasionally wandered to the gentle eyes and steady hands that had kept him alive that dark night. At the end of the day, exhausted but restless, Richard decided to do something unusual. Instead of taking his usual limousine, he dismissed the driver and opted to walk. The city's busy streets welcomed him with their familiar cacophony of honking horns, conversations, and the constant rhythm of hurried footsteps. As he walked, Richard found himself entering neighborhoods he didn't normally frequent. The streets became narrower, the buildings more modest. Then he saw it. A small community hospital, its lights shining warmly against the approaching night sky. Without much thought, Richard entered. The smell of antiseptic and the low murmur of conversation hit him immediately. For a moment he stood in the lobby, feeling strangely out of place in his expensive suit. "Can I help you, sir?" asked an elderly nurse, her face marked by years of dedicated service. Richard hesitated. Actually, I don't know why I'm here," he admitted, surprised at his own honesty. The nurse smiled gently. "Sometimes our feet take us exactly where we need to be, even if our mind doesn't know why." Her words touched something deep in Richard. With a grateful nod, he turned to leave, but not before noticing a poster on the wall. It was an advertisement for a blood drive. That evening, on returning to his luxurious apartment, Richard made a decision. He picked up the phone and called Melissa. "Mel, I need you to do something for me tomorrow," he said as soon as she picked up. "I want to make a substantial donation to community hospitals in the city. Anonymous." On the other end of the line, Melissa smiled, recognizing the tone in his voice. It was the same tone he used when he had a brilliant business idea. "Of course, Richard. I'll take care of it in the morning." Meanwhile, in a small apartment on the other side of town, Angela was snuggled up on the sofa next to her mother, Esther. The two shared a cup of tea, the evening news murmuring softly on the TV. "How was your day, dear?" Esther asked, her eyes full of maternal love and concern. Angela smiled, leaning against her mother's shoulder. "It was good, Mom. Lily, that little girl I told you about, she's responding well to the new treatment." Esther stroked her daughter's hair. "You make such a difference to these children's lives, Angela. I'm so proud of you." For a moment, Angela felt a twinge of guilt. She had never told her mother about the night of the accident, about how she had saved Richard Hartley's life. Part of her wanted to share this secret, to seek her mother's advice. But another part, the part that feared the complications the truth might bring, kept her silent. "Mom," Angela said softly, "do you think that sometimes fate has plans for us that we can't understand?" Esther looked at her daughter, noticing the shadow of concern in her eyes. "I believe so, my dear. But I also believe that we are the ones who write our own history, with our choices and actions." Angela nodded, lost in thought. Her mother's words echoed in her mind, mingling with the memories of that fateful night on the road. As the night wore on, two restless hearts on opposite sides of the city finally found some peace. Angela, wrapped in her mother's unconditional love, and Richard, inspired by a new purpose. Neither of them knew it, but their lives were about to intertwine again, in a way that neither of them could have foreseen. Fate, patient and implacable, was just waiting for the right moment to reveal its plans. And so, while the city slept, the cogs of fate continued to turn, setting the stage for the next act of this extraordinary story of connection, redemption, and discovery. Time, as always, flowed inexorably. 3 years had passed since that fateful night on the deserted road. The lives of Angela Martinez and Richard Hartley have followed their apparently separate courses, like two rivers running parallel, unaware that they are destined to converge. It was a spring afternoon when fate finally decided to reveal its hand. St. Francis Community Hospital, where Angela worked, was in an uproar. An anonymous benefactor had made a substantial donation, allowing the hospital to expand its pediatric ward and acquire state-of-the-art equipment. Angela walked through the newly refurbished corridors, a satisfied smile on her face. The once dull walls now displayed colorful murals of fairy tale characters and smiling animals. The sound of children's laughter echoed through the corridors, a melody that warmed her heart. "Angela," called out Dr. Torres, the head of pediatrics, approaching with hurried steps. "The benefactor is coming for a visit today. We need you to show him the new ward. You're the face of our nursing team." Angela felt a knot in her stomach. She had never liked being the center of attention. Me? But Dr. Torres, surely there's someone more qualified. The doctor smiled, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "No one knows these children better than you, Angela. Besides, your compassion and dedication are exactly what we want to show. The benefactor will arrive in an hour. Put on your best smile." Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Richard Hartley was adjusting his tie in front of the mirror. In recent years, he had dedicated himself to philanthropic causes with the same fervor he applied to his business. Every hospital he visited, every child who smiled thanks to the improvements his donations brought, made him feel one step closer to honoring the woman who had saved his life. "The car is waiting, Mr. Hartley," announced Melissa, his faithful assistant. Richard nodded, reaching for his jacket. "Thank you, Mel. Remind me again, which hospital are we going to today?" "St. Francis Community Hospital," Melissa replied, consulting her tablet. "They recently expanded the pediatric ward thanks to your donation." Something about the hospital's name made Richard pause for a moment, a strange feeling of déjà vu enveloping him. He shook his head, pushing the feeling away. "Right, let's go." The drive to the hospital was silent, with Richard immersed in his thoughts. When they arrived, they were greeted with great enthusiasm by the administrative team. Richard smiled and shook hands, but his eyes wandered as if looking for something or someone. "Mr. Hartley," said Dr. Torres, approaching with a warm smile. "It's an honor to have you here. Allow me to introduce Angela Martinez, one of our most dedicated nurses. She will guide you through the new wing." Time seemed to freeze as Richard and Angela came face to face. A flash of recognition passed through both their eyes, followed by a wave of conflicting emotions. Angela felt her heart racing, her mind spinning in a mixture of shock and disbelief. There, standing before her, was the man she had saved years ago. The man whose search for her had dominated the headlines for months. Richard, for his part, felt as if the air had been knocked out of his lungs. Those eyes. He would recognize them anywhere. The gentle voice that had kept him conscious on that dark night. The firm hands that had stopped his bleeding. It was her. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Hartley," Angela managed to say, her trembling voice betraying her outward composure. Richard held out his hand, feeling an electric current run through his body as their fingers touched. "The pleasure is all mine, Ms. Martinez." Dr. Torres, oblivious to the palpable tension between the two, continued talking animatedly about the improvements at the hospital. But for Richard and Angela, his words were a distant whisper. As they walked through the pediatric ward, Richard couldn't take his eyes off Angela. Every gesture, every smile she gave the children only confirmed what his heart already knew. It was her, his guardian angel. Angela, for her part, struggled to keep her composure. Her mind screamed at her to run, to hide, but her sense of duty kept her there, guiding the group through the colorful corridors. "And here," she said, stopping in front of a door decorated with stars and moons, "is our new treatment room. Thanks to your generosity, Mr. E. Hartley, we can offer advanced therapies that were only a dream for us before." Richard barely listened to the technical explanations. His eyes were fixed on Angela, studying every detail of her face, as if he wanted to record every line, every curve in his memory. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the visit came to an end. Dr. Torres was effusive in his thanks, but Richard had eyes only for Angela. "Ms. Martinez," he said, his voice low and intense, "would it be possible for us to talk in private for a moment?" Angela felt a chill run down her spine. This was the moment she had been dreading and secretly looking forward to. With a hesitant nod, she guided Richard into a small staff break room. As soon as the door closed behind them, Richard turned to face her, his eyes shining with a mixture of emotions. "It's you," he said simply, his voice charged with emotion. "All these years, I've been looking for you." Angela swallowed, feeling the weight of her secret pressing down on her chest. "Mr. Hartley, Please," he interrupted her gently. "Call me Richard. After what you've done for me, I think we can dispense with the formalities." She nodded, feeling suddenly vulnerable. "Richard, I'm sorry I didn't reveal myself sooner. I didn't want any complications. My life, my work here." Richard took a step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "I understand, but you have to know. You changed my life that night, not just by saving me, but by showing me what really matters." Angela felt tears forming in her eyes. "I only did what anyone would have done." "No," Richard said firmly. "Not anyone. You did. And I've spent the last 3 years trying to be worthy of what you've done for me." He made a sweeping gesture, indicating the hospital around them. "All of this, every hospital I've helped, every life I've tried to improve, has been my way of honoring you, to try to repay you for what you've done for me." Angela was speechless, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his actions and the depth of his gratitude. Richard continued, his voice soft but determined. "Now that I've finally found you, I want to do more. Let me help you, Angela. Anything you need, any dream you have." "No," Angela interrupted him, finding her voice. "I appreciate your gratitude, Richard. I really do. But I didn't do what I did expecting something in return. This work, these children, this is my passion, my life." Richard watched her for a long moment, admiration shining in his eyes. "You really are extraordinary, Angela Martinez." Before Angela could reply, a knock on the door brought them back to reality. Melissa, Richard's assistant, poked her head into the room. "I'm sorry to interrupt, Mr. Hartley, but we have that meeting in half an hour." Richard nodded, but his eyes never left Angela. "I'll be there in a moment, Mel." When they were alone again, Richard took a business card from his pocket and handed it to Angela. "Please think about what I've said. And if you ever need anything at all, don't hesitate to contact me." Angela took the card with trembling hands, feeling the weight of the moment. "Thank you, Richard. And thank you for everything you've done for this hospital, for these children." With one last look full of emotion, Richard left the room, leaving Angela alone with her thoughts in turmoil. As Richard was taken back to the hustle and bustle of the city, his mind was in turmoil. He had finally found her, his mysterious savior. But instead of closing one chapter of his life, this encounter seemed to have opened a completely new one. Angela, for her part, leaned against the wall of the restroom, her heart beating frantically. Richard's card weighed like a brick in her hand. She knew that her life was about to change drastically, whether she wanted it to or not. Fate, after years of patient waiting, had finally revealed its cards. And now, Richard and Angela found themselves on the threshold of a journey that would test not only their unexpected connection, but also the very foundations of who they were and what they believed in. As the sun set over the city, casting long shadows across the hospital corridors, two souls, once separated by time and circumstance, were now inextricably linked. What the future held for them, only time would tell. The weeks following their reunion in hospital were a whirlwind of conflicting emotions and thoughts for Richard Hartley and Angela Martinez. While Angela struggled to maintain her normal life, constantly looking over her shoulder as if expecting Richard to appear at any moment, the businessman found himself consumed by an overwhelming curiosity. In his office at the top of the Hartley skyscraper, Richard spun distractedly in his leather chair, Angela's business card between his fingers. He had respected her desire for space, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this story, something he couldn't decipher. "Melissa," he called through the intercom. "Can you come in here, please?" Moments later, his assistant walked in, tablet in hand, ready for another day of unpredictable demands from her boss. "Yes, Mr. Hartley." Richard hesitated for a moment, aware that what he was about to ask crossed an ethical line, but the need to know overcame his reservations. "I need you to carry out a discreet investigation about Angela Martinez, the nurse at St. Francis Hospital." Melissa raised an eyebrow, but maintained her professionalism. "May I ask why, sir?" Richard sighed, running a hand through his gray hair. "It's complicated, Mel. Let's just say that I have reason to believe there's more to her story than meets the eye. Use whatever resources you can, but keep it strictly confidential." With a nod of understanding, Melissa left to carry out her task, leaving Richard alone with his restless thoughts. Days turned into weeks as the investigation continued. Richard immersed himself in his work, trying to distract himself, but his thoughts always returned to Angela. There was something about her, a familiarity he couldn't explain, that tormented him. Finally, one rainy fall afternoon, Melissa walked into his office with a thick folder in her hands, her face pale and tense. "Mr. Hartley," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I think you need to see this." Richard picked up the folder with trembling hands, feeling the weight of what he was about to discover. As he opened it, his eyes flicked quickly through the pages, absorbing information about Angela's life, her birth, her childhood, her education. Suddenly, something caught his eye. A date. A name. Her heart stopped for a moment. That can't be true," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Melissa, who had sat in the chair opposite the desk, nodded gravely. "We've checked several times, sir. There's no doubt about it." Richard stood up abruptly, walking over to the window. The city stretched out below him, immense and indifferent to the emotional earthquake taking place in the office. "Angela, she's my daughter," he said, the words sounding strange in his ears. Memories flooded his mind. A summer romance over 35 years ago, a young woman called Maria who disappeared without a trace. He had looked for her at the time, but eventually moved on, burying that part of his past. Maria. She must have found out she was pregnant after she left, Richard muttered, more to himself than to Melissa. His assistant sniffled softly. "Sir, there's more. Angela's mother, Maria Martinez, died 5 years ago. Cancer." Richard felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. Maria, his first true passion, had left this world without his knowing it. And Angela, the daughter he never knew he had grown up without a father, only to save him on that road years later. Fate, Richard thought, had a cruel and ironic sense of humor. "What do you intend to do, Mr. Hartley?" Melissa asked softly, bringing him back to the present. Richard turned around, his eyes shining with a mixture of determination and fear. "I need to tell her, Mel. She deserves to know the truth." Melissa nodded, but her face expressed concern. "Sir, if I may, perhaps you should approach this carefully. It's a huge revelation, and considering how she reacted to your gratitude before." Richard agreed, his mind already formulating a plan. "You're right. I'll invite her to dinner. A neutral setting, where we can talk without interruptions." Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Angela was finishing her shift at the hospital. The last few weeks had been a test of her nerves. Every time the phone rang or someone entered the ward, she expected to see Richard. Part of her longed for another meeting, curious about the man whose life she had saved. Another part feared the complications such an encounter could bring. Her simple life, the job she loved, everything could change. When Angela got home, she found her Aunt Esther, who had moved in with her after her mother's death, watching television. "Hello, dear," Esther smiled warmly. "How was your day?" Angela threw herself on the sofa next to her aunt, exhausted. "The usual, Auntie. Lots of children, lots of smiles, a few difficult moments." Esther studied her niece's face for a moment. "Something's bothering you, isn't it? You've been distracted lately." Angela hesitated. She hadn't told her aunt about the reunion with Richard, fearing the questions that might arise. But before she could answer, the phone rang. With an apologetic look at Esther, Angela answered. "Hello? Angela? It's Richard Hartley." Angela's heart leapt into her throat. "Mr. Hartley. I mean, Richard. Please listen to me." Richard's voice sounded urgent, almost desperate. "I know you've asked for space, and I respect that. But there's something important I need to discuss with you. Something that will change our lives." Angela felt a shiver run down her spine. "What are you talking about?" "I can't explain over the phone. Please meet me for dinner tomorrow night. The Bella Luna restaurant at 8. It's important, Angela, more than you can imagine." There was a long pause while Angela considered her options. Finally, driven by a curiosity she couldn't explain, she agreed. "All right, Richard. I'll be there." After hanging up, Angela turned to find Esther watching her with a curious expression. "Who was that, dear?" Angela took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the secret she was carrying. "Just a friend, aunt, someone you need to talk to." Esther nodded, but her eyes said she knew there was more to the story. "Well, whatever it is, remember, you're strong, Angela, just like your mother was. Whatever life throws your way, you can handle it." Her aunt's words echoed in Angela's mind as she prepared for bed. Tomorrow, she would face Richard Hartley and find out what he wanted so desperately to tell her. Little did she know that the revelations that awaited her would change the course of her life forever, undoing everything she believed she knew about her origins and her place in the world. As night fell over the city, two restless hearts prepared for a meeting that would reveal long-buried truths and reshape the contours of their existences. Fate, patient as ever, was waiting for the moment to reveal its final hand. The Bella Luna restaurant glowed softly against the night sky, its golden lights reflecting in the windows of the surrounding buildings. Angela Martinez paused for a moment in front of the entrance, her heart beating frantically in her chest. She nervously adjusted the simple dress she had chosen for the occasion, wondering once again if she should have come. Inside the restaurant, Richard Hartley was waiting anxiously, his fingers drumming on the table covered with an immaculate white tablecloth. He had arrived an hour earlier, unable to concentrate on anything else. The folder containing the evidence of his shocking discovery weighed like lead in his leather briefcase beside his chair. When Angela entered the restaurant, Richard immediately stood up, his eyes fixed on her. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to see not only the woman who had saved his life, but the daughter he never knew he had. The curly hair, the expressive eyes, the determined jaw. How had he not noticed the similarities before? "Angela," he said softly as she approached. "Thank you for coming." Angela nodded tensely, taking a seat at the table. "You said it was important." Richard took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. "It is, more than you can imagine. But first, shall we order something to drink? Maybe it'll help to smooth things over." After placing their orders, a tense silence fell over the table. Angela studied Richard carefully, noticing the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes seemed to avoid hers. "Richard," she finally said, "why are we really here?" Richard closed his eyes for a moment, gathering his courage. When he opened them again, Angela was taken aback by the intensity of his expression. "Angela, what I'm about to tell you will change everything. All I ask is that you listen to me to the end, please." She nodded slowly, a knot forming in her stomach. Richard began to speak, his voice low and controlled. He told of a summer more than 35 years ago, about a young woman called Maria whom he had loved intensely. He talked about how she had suddenly disappeared, leaving him devastated and confused. Angela listened, her mind spinning, unable to understand why he was sharing this story with her. Until... "Angela," Richard said, his voice trembling slightly. "Maria was your mother." The world seemed to stop. Angela felt as if the air had been knocked out of her lungs. "What?" she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard continued, the words now flowing quickly, as if he feared his courage would leave him. He explained about the investigation, about the shocking discovery, about how fate had intertwined their lives in a way that neither of them could have foreseen. "Angela," he concluded, his eyes shining with unshed tears, "you're my daughter." The silence that followed was deafening. Angela felt as if she were falling into a bottomless abyss. Memories of her childhood, stories her mother had told her, little details that had never made sense. Everything now fitted together in a terrible, wonderful jigsaw puzzle. "No," she finally said, her voice shaking. "That can't be true. My mother would have told me. She protected you," Richard said softly. "Just as you tried to protect me by not revealing your identity after the accident." Angela stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly on the floor. "I need some air," she muttered, staggering towards the exit. Richard followed her, ignoring the curious glances of the other customers. Outside on the sidewalk, Angela was breathing heavily, her hands resting on her knees. "Why?" she finally asked, turning to face him. "Why now? Why after all these years?" Richard took a step towards her, but stopped when she stepped back. "I didn't know, Angela. I swear on all that's holy. I had no idea. If I'd known..." "If you knew what?" Angela retorted, years of repressed emotions coming to the surface. "Would you have come looking for us? Would you have been a father to me? Or would you simply have sent a check every month to ease your conscience?" The words hit Richard like a punch in the gut. "I would have done the right thing," he said softly. "I would have been there for you, for your mother." Angela laughed bitterly. The right thing, as if it were so simple. For a long moment they stood there, newly discovered father and daughter, separated by years of secrets and misunderstandings. The sound of the city around them seemed distant, as if they were in a bubble, cut off from the rest of the world. "I understand if you hate me," Richard finally said. "I understand if you never want to see me again. But please know that from the moment I discovered the truth, all I've wanted is to be a part of your life, to get to know you, to make up for lost years." Angela looked at him, really looked. She saw the pain in his eyes, the regret, the faint hope. And for the first time, she also saw herself reflected in him. The shape of his eyes, the curve of his chin, small details that she had always attributed to her mother, but which she now saw clearly came from this man in front of her. "I don't hate you," she finally said, her voice tired. I need time to process all this, to understand what this means for me, for my life." Richard nodded, relief and understanding mixed in his expression. "Of course. All the time you need. I'll be here, Angela, when and if you're ready." He took a card out of his pocket and handed it to her. "My personal number is there. Day or night, if you want to talk, ask questions, shout at me. I'll be available." Angela took the card mechanically, her fingers brushing against Richard's for a brief moment. An electric current seemed to pass between them, a connection that went beyond words or logic. I have to go," Angela said, her voice trembling. Richard nodded, resisting the urge to hug her. "Thank you for listening to me, Angela. And know that, no matter what happens from now on, I'm proud of the woman you've become. Your mother did an incredible job." The tears Angela had been holding back finally overflowed. With one last look at Richard, she turned and walked quickly down the sidewalk, disappearing into the night. Richard stood there, watching her go, his heart torn between the joy of discovery and the pain of separation. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult, full of emotional obstacles and years of history to overcome. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a spark of hope. Meanwhile, Angela walked aimlessly through the city streets, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions and thoughts. Her life, which had seemed so simple and defined only a few hours ago, was now turned upside down. She thought of her mother, of all the times she had asked about her father and received vague answers. She thought of Richard, the man she had saved on the road, now revealed as the father she had never known. And she thought of herself, of the long journey of self-discovery that now lay ahead of her. As the night wore on, father and daughter, physically separated but united by a newfound bond, faced an uncertain future. They both knew that nothing would ever be the same. The truth had come out, and with it, the promise of a new story, yet to be written. The months that followed the revelation were a time of emotional turmoil for both Angela and Richard. Autumn gave way to winter, and the city was covered in a white blanket of snow, as if nature itself was offering a new beginning, a blank page for this unexpected story. Angela spent weeks struggling with her emotions, alternating between anger, confusion, and a strange sense of relief. She sank into her work at the hospital, finding comfort in the routine and in caring for her patients. But at night, alone in her apartment, she found herself looking at the card Richard had given her, internally debating whether to call. Richard, for his part, respected Angela's desire for space, but the waiting consumed him inside. He channeled his anxiety into philanthropic work, donating even more to children's hospitals and causes, as if trying to make up for the years lost not only with Angela, but with all the children who never had the chance to meet their parents. It was on a cold January afternoon that Angela finally plucked up the courage to call. Her hands were shaking as she dialed the number. "Hello?" Richard's voice sounded on the other end, a mixture of hope and apprehension. "Richard, it's Angela." There was an emotionally charged pause. "Angela, Richard breathed, as if her name were a prayer. "I'm so glad you called." They talked for hours that night. Angela asked questions about his past, about his relationship with his mother, about the years that followed. Richard answered with brutal honesty, not hiding his mistakes or regrets. That phone call opened the door to more conversations. Gradually, they began to meet, first in neutral cafes, then in city parks, walking side by side as they shared stories of their lives. Angela talked about her childhood, about the challenges of growing up without a father, about how her mother had been her pillar of strength. Richard listened with a heavy heart, imagining all the moments he had missed. "I wish I'd been there," he said at one of these meetings, his voice breaking. "For your first day at school, to look after you when you were sick, to teach you how to ride a bike." Angela looked at him, seeing the genuine pain in his eyes. "We can't change the past, Richard. But maybe we can build something new." Those words were a turning point. They both realized that, although they couldn't make up for lost time, they had the opportunity to create new moments, new memories. Richard began to get more directly involved with Angela's work at the hospital. He visited regularly, not as the wealthy benefactor, but as a volunteer, reading stories to the children and offering comfort to worried parents. It was during one of these visits that Angela saw him in a new light. Richard was sitting next to the bed of Lily, the little